Andrew Mays, welcome. It's so good to talk to you about your fantastic book, which I enjoyed thoroughly. I found it a work not only of consummate scholarship, but a page-turner, a thrilling adventure read, eminently accessible. Congratulations on it.
Well, thank you. Coming from you, that is high praise indeed.
You're very kind. Now, of course, we'll talk about the subtitle of your book, if I may quote, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. But I think it might be helpful originally to talk about those two men in the context of their times. Of course, they were if I may, two men both alike in dignity, to quote from Shakespeare, and yet separated by 400 years and the Atlantic Ocean. Very, very different. But they shared one thing, a passion for, in the one case, writing, the other for collecting. But really put them in the context of their lives, if you would, please.
Sure. Well, Shakespeare was writing around the 1600s. His life was 20 years before, 20 years after the 1600s, during the reign of Elizabeth and James I. And he was a well-known playwright, poet. He wrote sonnets. And he was also a businessman. He was a shareholder in a theater company, the Globe Theater Company in London, and landowner, and very well known in his time for being a playwright and businessman. Henry Folger was the chairman, first president, then chairman of the board of the Standard Oil Company, the largest corporation in the world and most reviled corporation in the world at the time as well, during the Gilded Age. And, you know, Shakespeare wrote these plays. Years after he died, 7 years after he died, two of his friends decided to create a memorial volume to him and collected all of the sources they had available to him and published 36 of the known 38 plays that Shakespeare had written. And the two men are connected across time and across the ocean in that this book that saved half of Shakespeare's plays from obscurity became a fetish object for collectors. And Henry Folger, the chairman of the Standard Oil Company, wanted to own every known copy of this First Folio.
I learned something very interesting in your book. I thought of the Gilded Age as something in a very sacred term, referring to it that way. But in fact, it was Mark Twain who coined the term, and he was anything but complimentary about those who lived in the Gilded Age.
That's right. He was quite pejorative about it, and in part, the question is what the new wealthy did to display their wealth. They built these magnificent mansions in New York and Newport. They had ostentatious collections of art and books as well. They threw cash around Europe and bought up European treasures and then brought them back to the States. Henry Folger was quite different than most of the Gilded Age characters that we know of, J.P. Morgan, Henry Huntington, and the like. He was quiet, unassuming, came from very modest means, worked his way up the rungs of the ladder at the Standard Oil Company. But most of all, he never built himself a mansion he never owned a house until he retired from Standard Oil. He lived in a rented house in Brooklyn with rented furniture, lived a very modest life, and kept secret his obsessive passion for collecting Shakespeareana.
He probably could have built a bigger house if he didn't spend so much money on the manuscripts. We can talk about that.
Undoubtedly, that is true. But he displayed some of his artworks at his home, but most of the works that he collected, books, manuscripts, musical scores, musical instruments, costumes, playbills, and on, anything related to Shakespeare, he looked at, he studied, and then when the house was full to the brim, he would take them down into the basement, wrap them up, put them in a box, and then ship the box off to a warehouse. And I've looked at receipts for storage fees for 30 years for some of the rooms that he rented. So one by one, he would fill up these warehouses, rooms with his treasures, make an inventory, make a note of which box was in which room, and over 30 years accumulated room after room after room in these storehouses in Brooklyn and Manhattan.
I think there's a TV show called Hoarders, and probably I wouldn't raise him to the level of that, but there's a little element of that, I suppose.
There is a big element of that. If you're a person who's obsessed with collecting recyclable bottles or contemporary newspapers or magazines, and you stack them in your house to where you have to wind your way through and you can't walk through your house, we might say you have some kind of a borderline personality, or this interferes with your normal living. Well, Henry Folger certainly acquired things on that same scale, only the things he acquired were very valuable and interesting. So we don't call him a hoarder, we call him a magnificent collector.
Not the little boxes from Kentucky Fried Chicken of 10 years ago.
That's correct.
But now you have a connection with a collector, don't you, as well? Perhaps your husband. Do you want to talk a little about James Swanson, a very well-known author and a bit of a collector of other memorabilia?
Yes, a bit of a collector is an understatement.
I'm being kind.
You are being kind to him, yes. Part of my research on Henry Folger was informed by the fact that I do live with a collector, and he has been collecting objects, manuscripts, books related to Lincoln since he was 10 years old. And he has amassed an enormous collection that I've not quite seen the full extent of yet, because like Henry, James has had to put many of his objects into storage because there is no room for them. So he's got storage facilities in more than one state holding his collection.
More than one state that you know about.
That I know of. Right.
Well, and James also is the author of, a number of books, but particularly one of my favorites, Manhunt, the hunt for John Wilkes Booth after the Lincoln assassination. But let's go back in time a little further than that. Folio, the First Folio. Could you talk a little bit about what a folio is? It's a phrase that many viewers may not be familiar with. And then the First Folio of Shakespeare's works, and the two men you referred to earlier, really the saviors of Shakespeare's plays.
Sure. A folio refers to the size of the book. It's very large, 13 by 8 approximately, depending on how it's been shaved down in size.
So also the old-time magazine size,
yes,
Life magazine.
Right,
so
like a Life magazine
size. Not something like this size, but twice that.
That's correct. That's correct. That would be that book would be closer to something called a quarto, which would be about half the size of a folio. And what made it interesting was a folio size conveys some kind of gravitas to the work that's in it. And prior to this First Folio of Shakespeare, that size had really been reserved for political and religious tracts of some gravity.
Not fiction or literature.
Not fiction, really. Not literature, and certainly not plays, which were not regarded as literature. They were regarded as ephemeral amusements for the masses. The First Folio was a memorial volume that two of Shakespeare's friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, put together as a tribute to their deceased friend. And
may I ask, how long before had he passed away?
He died in 1616, and the First Folio was published in 1623. So the idea probably percolated about 5 years after Shakespeare's death, at which time by the time of Shakespeare's death, only half of his plays had been published. So there remained half of the oeuvre that would not have been known, arguably would not have been known to history had these two men not said, well, let's put these all together in one volume and save them for posterity. Many of the manuscripts, possibly even the only copies of the manuscripts, had gone up in flames at the Globe Theatre in 1613.
I know, what a horrific story. Imagine what the world would have had if that had not happened. And talk a little about how that fire came about. It was somewhat interesting and a bit reminiscent of some tragedies we've had in contemporary America recently.
Yes. First Folios, by the way, also have had a history with fire, but more on that a little bit later. The Globe Theatre was, like the other theaters in London, trying to attract patrons. It held 1,500 people, an enormous structure.
Pretty good size, really.
And one of the ways that they attracted patrons was that they added special effects. And one of the special effects, someone had the good idea of, let's use a real cannon and
not like
fire
Pixar, not computer-generated, a real
computer-generated, right. So they shot off a cannon upon the arrival of, I think it was Henry VIII, who arrives during a play. They announced his arrival with a cannon shot, and some of the wadding that was in the cannon floated up to the thatched roof of the Globe Theatre, and it caught fire and burned to the ground in 2 hours.
2 hours?
In 2 hours. The Great Fire of London is several years later, 1666, but at that time, the government had had enough and they outlawed thatched roofs in London until 1994 when the new Globe restoration was completed and they allowed that to have a thatched roof.
That's right. Presumably coated with fireproofing material,
yes,
something like
yes,
that.
right.
I would imagine.
Right,
that.
and no cannons being fired in there.
Now, one thing I found interesting was that the First Folio, it required them to get permission for some of these. Now, under American copyright law, which I used to practice, once an author creates something, he or she owns the rights to that forever, unless it's a work for hire. And upon their death, the estate would then get that property, the value. But Shakespeare had either licensed or sold the works to other people?
There was not copyright in Great Britain until 1709, long after this. So the way plays were paid for was that the theater companies bought them outright. So the Globe Theater Company would have paid for the plays, and then they would have had the rights both to perform or to publish.
And they could presumably have sold it if they found it was valuable or something.
If they found to do that. Mostly what they did was, in fact, exclusively what they did was they held them very closely. There was a single copy under lock and key at the theater with someone who's in charge of those manuscripts, because they feared that other theater companies would get copies of them and then take them out to other cities, perform the plays, and not pay them any royalties. So they figured, if we've got the rights to Hamlet, we want to have the only copy that's there. We don't want other theater companies performing Hamlet out in Leeds or Lincolnshire.
I know from the movie Shakespeare in Love, which presumably contained some historical accuracies.
A great deal.
A huge amount of rivalry between the players and the theatrical companies, rising to the level of a bit of swordplay, but perhaps that was exaggerated in the film. But we know that it was, although popular entertainment, extremely rivalrous.
Yes, there was a lot of competition among the theater companies. By the end of Shakespeare's career, he retires back to Stratford-upon-Avon in 1611. By that time, there are really only two major theater companies left in London, and part of the reason for that relates back to the Puritans prohibiting the production of plays. They didn't literally shut the theaters down, but that's also demonstrated in Shakespeare in Love, that the Master of the Revels shuts the theaters down.
The Master of the Revels, indeed.
Either for plague, or later the Puritans would say that plays were, an abomination against God, pretending to be something that you weren't, and then with men playing the parts of women, they were even more upset about them.
Included that great line, "That woman is a woman."
That woman is a woman, right. What, that old goat? Right. Yes, right.
Now, I was also fascinated as a former business journalist, and I covered the graphic arts and printing industry, to learn about Jaggert, the blind printer. Fascinating how the First Folio was actually constructed, how it was printed. It was massive. For one thing, 900 pages. Paper was a problem. But talk a little about that.
Yes. Let me start at the end of the story, is that without many copies of the First Folio to compare, it would be very difficult to draw the inference about how the book was actually printed. So having many copies available to compare side by side helps you figure out how the copy was printed. The long and the short of it is, which by the way is a phrase from Shakespeare, is that the book was printed from the inside out. You didn't print page 1, then page 2, then page 3. You printed them in little booklets, and you started at the middle of the booklet, and then you set the type moving from the inside out. It's very hard to understand, but I'll explain it in the book. This meant two things. One was that you as the printer had to estimate how much text would fit on a page so that you'd be able to fit this little booklet exactly. If you had too much room, not such a big problem. You could add a printer's ornament, something decorative. Sure. You could virtually double space the text. That wasn't a problem. If you ran out of space, on the other hand, you might have to print poetry as prose. You might have to excise a line from a speech. Oh, horrors. in order to make the text fit into
We
the
authors hate
allotted
that
space.
when the editor or the typesetter says, no, this isn't the last chapter, it has to go.
It doesn't fit. I mean, today, if you were on a, if you're using Microsoft Word, you would hit justify, and everything would fit to the space that you had allotted to it. Well, you couldn't do that. You had to hand set the type. So.
Now, one thing I'm very curious about, books today, of course, we have hardcover books, paperback books, we have ebooks enduring as long as there are bits and bytes and so forth. But the paper in many of today's books, I'm not speaking of literary, high-quality literary or art novels, but in popular fiction, full of acid, it doesn't last very long.
Right.
Talk about the paper, and actually, and we'll talk a little bit more about the present-day collection of the folios, but talk about, if you would, what are they? What is this paper made of? Is it in danger, or will it be in danger in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years?
The answer is yes. There's some. The paper that was used for printing the first folio was high-quality rag paper from Normandy, France. That was where the best paper came from, and that is what Jaggard used in printing the first folio. And part of that was to convey the importance of the volume, again, to say this is something important, this is something special. Something like a paperback book, a quarto size, which would be half the size of a folio, would have been printed on lower quality paper. It would have been more brittle, more acidic, and more likely to disintegrate, which is why the quarto size plays are much more rare.
Oh, we'll talk about the one that's really was quite astonishing.
And the folios have survived with pretty good numbers. They suffered hazards of time, fire, insects,
infestation.
Infestation, yes. People tearing plays out because it was more convenient to be able to carry one play around rather than this giant tome.
Book that was
yes.
that big.
So, but all things considered, a pretty good number of them have survived over
One
time.
thing I found fascinating was this was a business. Jaggard wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He had to really estimate if it made sense to print X number, Y number, and then he had to sell them, or someone had to sell them. How did, of the 750 copies, how did they get into the stream of commerce?
They were sold mostly out of the printer's shop.
So printer/bookseller in a way.
Printer, bookseller, and also all of that, the printing, the book selling, the paper warehouses would all have been around St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So St. Paul's, the square around St. Paul's is to printing in the 17th century what Broadway is to theater in the United States. So it would have been the locus of all of the bookshops. So that was in part geographic accident, but in part planned by the Crown, because the Crown wanted to know what was being printed and what ideas were being disseminated. So not only the printing presses, but the booksellers would have been under the watchful eye of the Crown at St. Paul's.
What would a first folio have cost at the time?
At time of publication, it would have cost £1, which was a pretty hefty
fair
sum of money. A quarto size, by contrast, for a single play might have cost 5 or 6 pence, so much cheaper.
Now, the first copy off the press of The Millionaire and the Bard is probably exactly the same as the 10,000th copy off the press of The Millionaire and the Bard.
Right.
That was not the case of the first folio, was it? There were some differences and variations. Was that because of the length differences or the actual construction of the book itself?
Well, there are two main reasons. One is that corrections to the text were made while printing was going on. So
really?
You might be printing, and at page 64, or copy number 64, the printer comes over, pulls a proof sheet off the press, and then makes corrections to it, has the type reset to make those corrections, misspellings, for example. Sometimes they put the actor's name instead of the name of the character, and so we had to correct that on the fly. Then that proof sheet would be stacked with the other pages and then later collated into the copies, and then the new pages that were printed off would have the corrected version. So for every page there was a single proof sheet, some uncorrected pages, and then some corrected versions. So if you sort of multiply that up by 900 pages, doing this 900 times, every copy is slightly different.
So had Jaggard taken over at this point? Was he the one overseeing that, or were Hemminges and Cadell very involved in that as well?
Hemmings and Condell's work was primarily beforehand. So they would have taken the sources available to them, the already printed or already published versions of the plays that had been available in quarto. They edited them. They had acted in these plays with Shakespeare. They were, had been friends with him for a long time, so they knew how the plays had been acted. So they could look at, for example, one of the quartos of Hamlet that had been published and say, oh, no, that's not how it was. This is how it was, and then edit it into the version that we more commonly know from that we know from the First Folio. So they would have used manuscripts that they would have had available to them as members of the theater company, and then their memorial recreations, and this all would have been in how they had edited essentially these plays. Once the manuscripts were transcribed probably by Ralph Crane, they got to the printer's shop, and then it was probably not so much Isaac, who was blind at this time, but his son, who would have done the corrections on the printing press.
Really.
Yes, right.
Now, what I'm thinking of is Shakespeare, to my surprise, did not really become hugely popular until sometime after his death. I mean, he was a well-known Elizabethan and Jacobean playwright, of course, and people enjoyed his work, but it was 140 years, I believe, until his popularity began to soar. What happened to the First Folios in that time? Were they marginalized, or did people truly recognize that someday this would be a valuable book?
I don't know that collectors or actors or producers thought at the time, someday people will recognize how great this is. In fact, over that period of time, we had the English Civil Wars, during which the Puritans took over Parliament, and then they prohibited plays from being produced, which meant that there were no new plays being written, and the old plays were not being performed. So it was quite some time, not until the Restoration, that Shakespeare's plays again come back to the stage. And by then, public tastes have changed a little bit. The producers of the plays start to change the endings. Yes, and one.
I've had several movies made in Hollywood. I know how that works.
Yes, right. Hester Prynne walks away and she's victorious at the end
with a machine gun on a motorcycle.
Right, exactly. Well, a particular actor owned a copy of a folio, a man named David Garrick, and he was a very well-known tragic actor. He edited the plays himself, producing them in London. For example, Romeo and Juliet, he produced alternate nights with happy endings or sad endings, if you can imagine. A few of the plays he cut an act or two to keep the narrative moving along quickly. A whole act. In fact, in Twelfth Night, I think he cut 2 acts to keep the narrative moving more quickly.
The sixth night.
The sixth night, right. And so by the time we get to the 150 years after Shakespeare's death, the plays are quite different than what we remembered. And it's really by going back to the First Folio that we have a good idea of how they would have been performed at the time that Shakespeare was still alive.
Well, this brings up a very interesting point. Of course, we're speaking primarily of the First Folio, but there were other folios as well. Right. And I found fascinating in the, I think it was the Third Folio, all of a sudden one would be familiar, let's say, with the First Folio. You see a copy of the Third Folio, open it up, 7 new plays.
Right.
Only one of which was apparently attributable to Shakespeare. Where did the others come from? And talk a little about the other folios.
Well, there were 4 folios altogether. There were like 4 editions. Each of them got further and further away from the original text as Hemmings and Condell had edited the plays. So again, they would have acted in these plays and known how they had been acted. There are hundreds of mistakes that are introduced into the later folios, and essentially First Folio sells out in 9 years. The Second Folio is produced, third, fourth. They add these apocryphal plays to which you refer. Imagine if I could dig into my attic and say, I found a manuscript of Harper Lee's 4th novel and 5th novel, and then 50 years posthumously or 20 years posthumously, I publish them as her work. Well, that's what was going on. They thought they could make a little extra money by saying, the fourth folio is better than the first, buy this one.
Well, now we'll talk about Henry Folger's acquisition of a fourth folio at one point, but they must have had some intrinsic value, though, for true collectors.
Yes.
Someone would want to have maybe the whole panoply of folios, if possible.
Yes, and there are certainly collectors like Huntington and Morgan and Folger who wanted to own the complete set.
Of everything.
Most of those collectors wanted the high spots, a really good quality copy of one of each. Folger wanted every copy he could get his hands on. Good copy, bad copy, with graffiti in it, missing plays, with torn pages, with, insect board holes in them, the rusty outline of scissors or eyeglasses in them where people had left the volumes shut for years. He wanted them all.
Now, I have to bring up something, Andrea. Now, I'm not going to charge you royalties for this. However, I should let you know, as you and I have talked before, let the viewers know, my last name is Deaver, and I am, according to my family genealogists, descended from the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, who was within it's called the anti-Stratfordians. Is that the correct way to pronounce it?
That's
the conspiracy theorists who feel that Shakespeare did not, in fact, write the plays. He was sort of a front man. I do not subscribe to that, so I'm not going to hit you up for any royalties, as I say, for my part in the Shakespeare, the whole Shakespeare story. But talk a little bit about that, because people do find it fascinating.
Right, so broadly it's called the authorship question. Did Shakespeare really write those plays? And as you say, there's a group of people who have various candidates for whom they believe actually wrote the plays that are attributed to Shakespeare. And there are a few things that are important to know. One is that in his lifetime, nobody doubted that Shakespeare had written those plays.
Oh, is that right? Really?
It was 150 years before someone said, I don't think this man really wrote the plays. If you go back to Stratford-upon-Avon, there isn't voluminous evidence of even his existence there. There are no, for example, grammar school records that show that he went to the grammar school there. He didn't go to university. How could he have written these plays without a university education? So the Earl of Oxford is one of the candidates. Christopher Marlowe is another.
Of course.
Francis Bacon was the most popular. Delia Bacon in the mid-1800s wrote a book essentially purporting that Francis Bacon had written, no relation to her, by the way, had written these plays, and it had not been anyone named William Shakespeare. Ms. Bacon has a very interesting story of her own. She went to England supposedly to research the authorship question. She didn't actually do any research. She went to the town and absorbed the atmosphere, but didn't do any interviewing or archival research.
We fiction writers do that a lot.
We just absorb just go there and absorb the atmosphere. She didn't end so well, although her book had an introduction written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who regretted for the rest of his life that he had written the introduction because he'd not actually read the book.
He hadn't read the book, yes.
She ended up in an insane asylum at the end of her life.
Oh, my.
So she had an interesting
story,
life on her own. That alone doesn't mean that her hypothesis is incorrect. However, we have a lot of evidence that Shakespeare existed in Stratford-upon-Avon. He lived in London. He wrote plays. His contemporary playwright fellows wrote about him as a playwright.
And he acted in the plays.
He acted in the plays. The English were tremendously accurate record keepers, and someone called the Master of the Revels would have kept a record of not only what plays were performed at court, but who had written the plays and who had acted in them, and Shakespeare is mentioned in there dozens of times. So Elizabeth and James, Queen Elizabeth and James I, would have known who Shakespeare was and whose plays they were. John Webster, in the preface to The White Devil, writes about his friend William Shakespeare, playwright. Ben Jonson, comic writer at the time, wrote in the preface to the First Folio and elsewhere, compliments about his friend William Shakespeare. So we have a lot of information about connecting Shakespeare to the plays.
I did have to point out to my cousin, who was, as I say, the avid conspiracist or anti-Stratfordian, because of our namesake, of course, he was a Deaver as well, that Edward de Vere died before Macbeth was first performed, before The Tempest, Henry VIII, several other plays as well. And he said, well, but Edward de Vere could have written them and hidden them under his bed or in a cottage somewhere. And
right. So that showed amazing prescience on the part of the Earl of Oxford, that he continued to have plays published years after he died. Yes.
Very, very smart. But now, please go ahead.
What you mentioned, Macbeth. The most important feature of the First Folio is that it saved half of Shakespeare's plays from extinction. From that era, we have diarists and records from the Master of the Revels of about twice as many plays as we actually have copies of.
Twice as many. Oh my.
And by the time Shakespeare had died, only half of the plays had been published and were sort of secure, well, not 100% secure, from being extinct. But it was Hemmings and Condell who published the other half of these plays, and arguably without that book, those plays would have been lost to history. Plays like Macbeth, there would have been no Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Indeed.
There, As You Like It, no Rosalind. The Tempest, no Caliban, no Prospero. No Julius Caesar, no Coriolanus, no Antony and Cleopatra, and on and on. So some of the most important plays that we know from Shakespeare, no high schooler would be studying Macbeth. They are really the unsung heroes of English literature, that they saved half of these plays from extinction.
And don't we have the First Folio to thank for the one extant picture of Shakespeare?
We do. There are two images of Shakespeare. One is an effigy made out of plaster that is in the chancel at Stratford-upon-Avon, but that was commissioned after Shakespeare's death, although it was seen by his family members who would have said, oh, no, that's not what he looked like if it had been a problem. But Hemmings and Condell commissioned a Flemish engraver to make an image which would be the title page of the First Folio. By the way, this is really the first time the author's picture was on the title page in such a prominent position. They would have provided some kind of secondary source, sketch or painting or something that we don't know. And then Droeshout would have engraved this and then shown it to Hemmings and Condell, and they could have said, a little more hair, a little less hair, bigger mustache, whatever it was.
Like a police sketch artist.
Like a police sketch artist, although they would probably have had to do that with the source that the engraver was working from, because it would be really hard to erase from a copper engraving. But at least Hemmings and Condell, who did know Shakespeare, would have seen the image and could have said, oh no, that's not what he looks like at all.
Now, we've been talking about England, the British Isles. Let's cross the pond a bit. Of course, Shakespeare and theater in general did not catch on quite as much, certainly in colonial days, until much, much later. I had this wonderful quote from your book about the Puritan Increase Mather, who said this: persons who have been corrupted by stage plays are seldom and with much difficulty redeemed. So it took a little while for Shakespeare to get some footing in America. How long did that take, in fact?
It takes about a century. And for almost the same reasons that some of the plays would have disappeared in England, and that is that the Puritans, who had shut down the production of plays in England, were the ones who came to the colonies, and they would not allow plays to be produced here either. So it took about a century before Shakespeare started even out on the frontier, was read and then performed.
So tell us about the confluence of William Shakespeare and Henry Folger. When did he become interested, and when did he really start to get an inkling that I need to possess this man's plays?
I think it happens, as with many collectors, over a period of time. It started, he was studying the plays at Amherst College. He heard Ralph Waldo Emerson deliver a lecture and then became interested in Emerson, read Emerson's lecture on Shakespeare and thought, okay, this is worth some closer study. And for the rest of his life, he read the plays. They affected him personally. He thought Shakespeare had really captured modern man, and amazingly, modern man is not that different in 1880 than he is in 400 years later. 400 years earlier. So from the plays inform him, about love and life and jealousy and competition.
As they do
and
us
loyalty,
all, of course.
as they do
everything.
us all.
He covered
so,
everything.
Part one is he really liked the plays. Part two is once he had a little bit of income in his pocket, he started to collect copies of the folio. As you mentioned, the first one that he acquires at Bang's Auction House in New York. Isn't that a great name?
Isn't it?
And that's hammered down to him at $107.50, and he has to pay for that over time. He doesn't have enough money to pay for that.
Now, may I interrupt? Was he at that point, because we know he went to law school as well, and even while he was in law school, he would have his law books and then reading fiction, and often an author that had been influenced by Shakespeare, Goethe, Schiller, Victor Hugo, and so forth.
And Carlyle, yes.
Carlyle. Now, was at that point when he acquired his fourth folio, was he indeed a student, or was he working at that point?
He was already working, but he was also known to carry around copies of the play in his pocket. And on his time on the streetcar, going back and forth between Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, he would have been reading the Shakespeare plays. He and his wife, Emily, also went to many Shakespeare performances in New York. So he enjoyed watching the plays, reading the plays, and then eventually he encountered Shakespeare scholars. Once he was sort of an established collector, he would write back and forth with some of the Shakespeare scholars and discuss the text and how was this part performed and how strong was Lear in this scene. Was he near madness or was he still strong?
So this was definitely more than just possessing an object.
That's right.
He was involved in the whole milieu of the Shakespearean world, from the portfolios or from the folios to the acting, to the theater production, and so on. Talk about one of the mysterious acquisitions in his life, his first folio. We don't know a lot about that, do we?
Yes. Ironically, for a man who saved many, many scraps of paper and thousands upon thousands of letters over the 40, 50 years that he was writing, we know very little about the very first acquisition. We know it's around 1881 to 1883. We know its condition, but we don't really know we don't have a record of how much he paid for it, for example.
Now, I was absolutely enthralled with your description of rare manuscript collecting of the era, that Gilded Age. Presumably much of it still continues today. How people would want an unsophisticated manuscript, an unwashed manuscript. We find disparaging terms elsewhere, but certainly not to the manuscripts. There were agents and spies involved. Talk a little about that, if you would, please.
The first folio is really exceptional in the book collecting world in that a copy that is missing plays, missing pages, is damaged in a number of ways, missing its original title page, missing its cover, in bad shape. It's still desirable to collectors. And if you had that for example, a manuscript of Jack London's White Fang, you probably wouldn't be interested. It's missing pages, and you would probably not be interested in that as a collector. The first folio is exceptional in that collectors doesn't matter what the condition is, the price changes, but they want copies no matter where they are. And that makes them a little bit of a fetish object, although, as I've said before, although Folger was incredibly acquisitive and he wanted every one of these copies, it was not just as a fetish object. He actually did read the plays. Now,
in one of your wonderful stellar reviews, one of the many stellar reviews of your book, I can't remember what publication it was, but it referred to the basically three men and a woman who we have to thank for this wonderful find, Hemmings, Cudrell, and then, of course, Henry Folger, but his wife, Emily, whom you referred to.
Right.
She was instrumental in the collection process, wasn't she?
She was. The review was Stephen Greenblatt in the New York Times said that. And Hemmings and Condell, again, without them editing the plays, we would not know half of the plays that we do today. Emily was the unsung hero for two reasons. One is if you're an obsessive collector and you're running the world's largest corporation during the day, and you come home at night and you sift through catalogs, and even when you go on vacation, you bring your inventory of your collection with you just in case something comes up and you need to find out if you have a better copy or an inferior copy and should you order it. It's very helpful to have a spouse who shares that passion with you. Otherwise, soon it interferes with your life.
I can understand that,
yes. And she shared his passion both for Shakespeare. So she had written her master's thesis on the true text of Shakespeare. She was not a dilettante either. And she also participated on a daily basis in going through the catalogs and making inventories of what was in their collection and suggesting to Henry what it is that they should buy. She also attended many of the performances of the plays and kept a diary of that as well. And that made her an exceptional partner in this pursuit of Shakespeareana. So Henry lucked out in this wife who really was very compatible with him on that. Second, though, is that at the time that Henry died in 1930, the stock market had already crashed in October 29, and the value of the endowment that he planned to leave behind to fund the library had been cut by about 40%. And had Emily not been as generous with her own money, the library would never have been completed.
Ah, really?
So after his death, the finances were not as generous as Henry had expected that they would be. And without Emily participating in and giving her money to the building of the library, it would not have opened.
Now, my impression was that when Henry and Emily first got started in this, they were more devoted to the folios and the Shakespeareana itself than to the art of collecting. They made some mistakes. He had some disappointments. In fact, I think didn't he try to talk Rockefeller into purchasing a huge body of work, a library of work, and suggesting that Rockefeller could then enter the public to make some money, defray the costs, enter the publishing world to sell little pocketbooks of these, which did not work out. But talk about some of his, how he stumbled a little bit, how he got his feet.
Well, that was a case of a man who was very talented at financial brinksmanship, but could not have scraped together the money to buy this entire collection that had gone up for sale. And he wrote a letter. We don't know if he actually sent this to Rockefeller, but I suspect he spoke to him about this, saying, hey, you've just endowed the University of Chicago. Yale has got a collection of First Folios. Harvard's got First Folios. Maybe University of Chicago would like to have a great collection of Shakespeareana. And I'd be willing to go through the collection with you and tell you which are the most valuable pieces and which should be reproduced, and you could sell them and defray the cost of acquiring the collection. So that did not work. Rockefeller did not buy that.
And it went
collection.
to a competitor, Marston Perry, and he was, I assume, a bit miffed about that. Folger was.
Yes. Ultimately, some of that collection finally did get to Folger. So 1907, there's a financial panic, and Marston Perry suffers a loss of a tremendous collection of Shakespeareana to Henry Huntington, and he says, if I can't get the best, I'm just going to give up this Shakespeare thing altogether. And he started selling off his collection as well. And so ultimately, Henry Folger did get some of that collection.
Now, one of the most thrilling accounts in your book is of a particular manuscript, and if I may quote, it has been described as the single most valuable and desirable copy of the First Folio in the world. That was Augustine Vincent's, and apparently Augustine Vincent, a contemporary of Jaggard, who apparently gave him the copy in person. And it ended up in the collection of, let's see, Constance B. Sibthorpe. Is that correct?
Coningsby Sibthorpe, right.
Sibthorpe.
Con for short.
Con for short. Thank goodness it was Con, because that's a name you could certainly not make up. But that acquisition had its true ups and downs. Could you talk about it a bit,
Sure.
please?
Folger became aware of the existence of this superb copy, complete with all the original leaves from one copy of the folio. It had not been supplied from another copy or anything like that. It was very tall, had a part of its original 17th century cover within the modern cover that had been put on it. And we knew its provenance. We knew who had owned it from the get-go. So it was the only presentation copy that we know of Shakespeare's First Folio, given by the printer to his friend Augustine.
Now, what does that presentation copy refer to?
Just that we know that either the author or the publisher gives a copy to a specific person.
Oh.
And the two that we know of, one is to Augustine Vincent, and if you look at the end papers of the book, it has that presentation copy with the inscription by the printer in it. The other presentation copy would have gone to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, which was mandated, essentially the same way, a deposit copy.
That incident too, if we have a chance. But go on about the Sibthorpe acquisition.
Folger becomes aware of this copy because a census is published in 1903 by an English Shakespeare scholar, and then for 4 years he chases after the copy. He finds out, how much does this guy want for this superb copy? It's a lot of money. Folger says, well, could I buy it over time? Could I look at it on approval? That's a lot of money. And by the time he's made up his mind and maybe he's been able to scrape together the financial wherewithal to buy the volume, the Englishman who owns the copy says, well, I've changed my mind. I'd rather have the book to look at than a check. But if you write to me once a year around Christmas time, ask me if I've changed my mind.
Asking Folger to do that, and
That's
it's
correct.
putting the onus on him to get in touch with me again.
That's correct. So you come and ask me, genuflect, and ask me if I'm ready to sell my book or not. And then at some point, actually, Sibthorpe writes to Folger and says, well, someone else has offered me some money. He writes to a book dealer and tells him, somebody else has offered me money for this, and that information gets back to Folger, and he says, well, if you'd be willing to offer me £10,000, which was an enormous sum.
Amount of money.
It was the record price for a book at the time. Folger, again, had perhaps some financial difficulty in getting all the money together at once and demurred a little bit, and can I pay for it over time? Almost lost it, but in the end did
See,
pay
it's
the
a real
$10,000.
roller coaster, Andrew. When you follow the story in the book, your palms are sweating to see, is he going to, it's snatched away from him. Now is an opportunity to get it again.
Right. Well,
Please go ahead.
the idea was to have you go on the same ride that Henry did, which was, you don't know whether he's going to end up with a copy or not.
No.
And it is suspenseful, and at least was rooting for him that he would ultimately get the copy. So.
But that brings up an interesting point. Oh my gosh, we have so much to talk about. But this was, as I was reading the book, I was thinking, my initial reaction, well, here are the Brits, and this is their boy, their star playwright, and here's an upstart Yankee hoovering up all of these First Folios. Would there never be any backlash? But indeed there was some backlash, and I think that was the manuscript you were referring to. Is that right?
It happens twice. There is a copy that is owned by the Bodleian Library, and when the Bodleian acquired a subsequent folio, second or third folio, they decided to sell their First Folio as surplus, so it's gone. And years later, some collector comes into the Bodleian and asks them, can you verify that this is a First Folio? Well, they look at this. They look at the unique cover, which contained a hasp that a chain would have gone through, and the chain would have been attached to a shelf so that somebody could have read the book, but they would have to stand there and read it. They couldn't steal it. And this is unique to these copies that are at the Bodleian Library, all bound by a man named William Wildgoose, another great English name.
And we have had some interesting names in our conversation today.
Yes, there are. Short version of the story is the Bodleian wanted to buy this copy back from this collector, and the collector named a price of £2,000. And Folger said, where do I send the check? I want to buy that copy. I'll take it right now. And meanwhile, the Bodleian was trying to raise money to be able to buy it back for its own collection. And articles appeared in the newspaper and the Times Literary Supplement and Notes and Queries, this for the book collecting world newspapers, saying, won't anybody, pony up the money to buy this as a unique... Yes, absolutely. Where are the, Oxford men are not ponying up the money to buy this back. Some Cambridge men have even given some money. Where are you?
Heaven forbid.
And in one of the newspapers, a cartoon was published of a faceless millionaire, because they didn't know who it was, who the American collector was.
So it was anonymous at that point.
He was anonymous. He was going through his book dealer, Southern, in London. And it was a portrait of someone like Moneybags from the board game Monopoly.
Of course.
A man clasping bags of cash and looking at English treasures. Who is this faceless millionaire? And there was a great deal of backlash that these treasures were being brought overseas. The second time that happened was following Henry Huntington's acquisition of Gainsborough's Blue Boy and Folger's acquisition of the Vincent copy. Cartoon appeared with Uncle Sam with Blue Boy under one arm and a First Folio under the second arm, and looking over at Shakespeare's bones in his grave and thinking, I'd like to bring those back to America as well. So this was
the Fleet Street Press was
yes,
certainly get their digs in.
They were not happy that the Americans with a lot of cash were coming and buying their cultural treasures and liberating books from the dusty libraries of the aristocrats of England and taking them back to the United States.
Well, our time is racing along. I can't believe it's gone by so quickly, and I do have a few other, I have many other Shakespearean questions, but I do want to turn the tables just a bit here. You, in your book, have a lovely dedication to your mother and to your father, who, if I remember correctly, I'm not quite phrasing it exactly right, but who enlisted in His Majesty's Navy to defend Shakespeare's England. I found that very touching. Well, let's talk about you a little bit, Andrea, if you would, please. I know you have economics degrees. You teach economics now. I think you were a protege of Frank McCourt, were you not?
That's right.
One of my favorite writers, personages. Talk a little about that, and also how you came to write the book.
Okay. My father is English, and he joined the Navy at age 17, and he and his brother fought during World War II. That's where the dedication comes from. He, by the way, took me to Stratford-upon-Avon when I was a teenager. I guess that was my first...
Is that when the bug caught you?
It was probably the kernel. The storytelling came from Frank McCourt, and his mentor, who was one of my high school teachers, who taught me Shakespeare and Jacobean literature. He was a quintessential storyteller, and it didn't matter what it was about. He could tell a great yarn and taught us about how to develop dramatic tension and how to tell a good tale. So I hope I learned something from him.
As this book does, because as I mentioned in my remarks, and I believe it was another review, I read so many of them, all glowing, it called it a page turner, and it really is. Notwithstanding, being a former attorney and working on a law review, when I was in school, I appreciate footnotes. And you are as meticulous about footnotes as anything else, but that does not affect the readability of the book. It is just a page-turning adventure tale. Absolutely is.
Thank you.
Now, one thing I would like to talk about, and you'd alluded to it before, if any viewers are familiar with Folger at all prior to our discussion or prior to reading your book, they would think of the Folger Library, of course. And you mentioned that a little bit, but how many tons of Shakespeareana did Folger have? Toward the end of his life, he knew he wanted it to have a home. And how the Folger Library came about is rather interesting. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Henry and his wife, Emily, were friends with Shakespeare scholar Howard Furness at University of Pennsylvania. And it was he that suggested to Henry, hey, you should build a library, not just pack these things away in books. He would ask him, for example, well, how many copies do you have? Or do you have a copy of this that I can look at? And he would say, well, it's all away in storage. I can't get to it. Dozens of librarians and scholars wrote to him and said, oh, you have this copy, First Quarto of Hamlet. Can I have a look at it? And he would say, well, sorry, it's all packed away. And the idea came to him, certainly by the turn of the century, he should build a library and make this available to scholars.
Just one question, if I may interrupt. Did he have it cataloged? Did he know everything he had?
The answer is no. Emily cataloged all of the books. She hand wrote index cards detailing, what the publication was and what the condition was, where they bought it, what the price was, and so on. Those index cards still exist, but he didn't catalog everything, and in part because it started arriving in such great volumes that he couldn't keep up with it. He would buy watercolor paintings by the boxful, by the crateful, and it was not all cataloged. In fact, there's so many individual items at the Folger Library that they're still not all cataloged today.
All right. Well, so we have this massive material, so please go on with how the library came about.
Henry and Emily consider building the library in New York City. But with their modest, relatively modest endowment, they cannot afford real estate there. Some things never change.
Yes.
And Emily had grown up in Washington, D.C. Her father had worked for the Abraham Lincoln Treasury, and so she was familiar with Washington. And on one of their train trips to West Virginia for vacation, they stopped by and they looked around at the property on Capitol Hill, and they said, this would be a good place. I wonder how much it would cost to do that. And the end of the story is they bought the property here and were able to build the library with the money that they had allocated.
But there was a little drama about the property, wasn't there?
There was. It took a total of 9 years to buy up all of the 14 townhomes on East Capitol Street between 2nd and 3rd. By the time he finished acquiring all of the properties, the Congress had made a decision to expand the Library of Congress, which is across the street, and they were going to use eminent domain to take the property that Henry had just acquired. So imagine he's spent 9 years acquiring the property, looks in the newspaper, Congress is going to take the property. So he enlisted the help of the Librarian of Congress. This is, after all, the president of Standard Oil that is writing the note and saying, hey, are you going to take this property? I won't build the library if you're going to take and condemn the property. And the Librarian of Congress, named Putnam, helped him deal with Congress in carving out the parcel that he had purchased from the acquisition that the Library of Congress made. So the Library of Congress expansion building is behind the Folger Library.
Oh, they managed to work it out.
They managed to work it out.
Well, I would encourage viewers to go there. I've been there many times. And in fact, they have a wonderful gift shop at which I bought a medieval cookbook and hosted a medieval banquet for about 40 or 50 people. And it was a great time. Yes, and turkey legs were thrown at each other. We had a great time doing that. Now, we're almost out of time, but I do have a question for you. You describe yourself, or at least the copywriter on the back of this book, describes you as obsessive. And mirroring Henry Folger, of course. How many extant First Folios are there accounted for, both at the Folger Library, that is within Henry's collection, and elsewhere around the world?
There are 82 copies at the Folger Library. The next largest collection, just for means of comparisons, is at Meisei University in Japan, and that is 12.
Oh my.
The next largest after that is the British Library, and that is 5. So it is not common for people to have a dozen or more copies of the First Folio. We know of, as of November of last year, we know of 244 copies of the 750 that we think were originally printed.
So there is out there somewhere a First Folio for you.
Oh, that would be delightful. I could probably afford a page of a First Folio.
But maybe you'll do some detective work and find one in a barn somewhere. And,
maybe I will. Maybe I will. There's some cipher there that will lead me to the lost manuscripts of Shakespeare. There are a few plays that we know about that he wrote that we don't have copies of, so they're still out there.
But curious, are things still being discovered? Is that possible?
Yes. In fact, copies of the first, no manuscripts have been discovered. We do not have a single manuscript in Shakespeare's hand, but copies of the First Folio have recently gone for between $5 and $6.5 million. So many librarians flip through their inventories and say, maybe I have one out there as well. And in fact, a French university at Saint-Omer near Calais recently discovered a copy, last year discovered a copy and had it verified that is number 244.
Oh, very exciting. Well, I see our time is up, and I wish you luck in your quest. Andrea Mays, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Probably I wouldn't raise into the level of that, but there's a little element of that, I suppose.
There is a big element of that. If you're a person who's obsessed with collecting recyclable bottles or contemporary newspapers or magazines, and you stack them in your house to where you have to wind your way through and you can't walk through your house, we might say you have some kind of a borderline personality, or this interferes with your normal living. Well, Henry Folger certainly acquired things on that same scale, only the things he acquired were very valuable and interesting. So we don't call him a hoarder, we call him a magnificent collector.
Not the little boxes from Kentucky Fried Chicken of 10 years ago.
That's correct.
But now you have a connection with a collector, don't you, as well? Perhaps your husband. Do you want to talk a little about James Swanson, a very well-known author and a bit of a collector of other memorabilia.
Yes, a bit of a collector is an understatement.
I'm being kind.
You are being kind to him, yes. Part of my research on Henry Folger was informed by the fact that I do live with a collector, and he has been collecting objects, manuscripts, books related to Lincoln since he was 10 years old. And he has amassed an enormous collection that I've not quite seen the full extent of yet, because like Henry, James has had to put many of his objects into storage because there is no room for them. So he's got storage facilities in more than one state holding his collection.
More than one state that you know about.
That I know of. Right.
Well, and James also is the author.
The largest corporation in the world and most reviled corporation in the world at the time as well, during the Gilded Age. And, Shakespeare wrote these plays. Years after he died, 7 years after he died, two of his friends decided to create a memorial volume to him and collected all of the sources they had available to him and published 36 of the known 38 plays that Shakespeare had written. And the two men are connected across time and across the ocean in that this book that saved half of Shakespeare's plays from obscurity became a fetish object for collectors. And Henry Folger, the chairman of the Standard Oil Company, wanted to own every known copy of this First Folio.
I learned something very interesting in your book. I thought of the Gilded Age as something in a very sacred term, referring to it that way. But in fact, it was Mark Twain who coined the term, and he was anything but complimentary about those who lived in the Gilded Age.
That's right. He was quite pejorative about it, and in part, the question is what the new wealthy did to display their wealth. They built these magnificent mansions in New York and Newport. They had ostentatious collections of art and books as well. They threw cash around Europe and bought up European treasures and then brought them back to the States. Henry Folger was quite different than most of the Gilded Age characters that we know of, the J.P. Morgan, Henry Huntington, and the like. He was quiet, unassuming, came from very modest means, worked his way up the rungs of the ladder at the Standard Oil Company. But most of all, he never built himself a mansion he never owned a house until he retired from Standard Oil. He lived in a rented house in Brooklyn with rented furniture, lived a very modest life, and kept secret his obsessive passion for collecting Shakespeareana.
He probably could have built a bigger house if he didn't spend so much money on the manuscripts. We can talk about that.
Undoubtedly, that is true. But he displayed some of his artworks at his home, but most of the works that he collected, books, manuscripts, musical scores, musical instruments, costumes, playbills, and on, anything related to Shakespeare, he looked at, he studied, and then when the house was full to the brim, he would take them down into the basement, wrap them up, put them in a box, and then ship the box off to a warehouse. And I've looked at receipts for storage fees for 30 years for some of the rooms that he rented. So one by one, he would fill up these warehouses, rooms with his treasures, make an inventory, make a note of which box was in which room, and over 30 years accumulated room after room after room in these storehouses in Brooklyn and Manhattan. I
think there's a TV show called Hoarders, and there are a number of books, but particularly one of my favorites, Manhunt, the hunt for John Wilkes Booth after the Lincoln assassination. But let's go back in time a little further than that. Folio, the First Folio. Could you talk a little bit about what a folio is? It's a phrase that many viewers may not be familiar with. And then the First Folio of Shakespeare's works, and the two men you referred to earlier, really the saviors of Shakespeare's plays.
Sure. A folio refers to the size of the book. It's very large, 13 by 8 approximately, depending on how it's been shaved down in size.
So also the old-time magazine size,
yes,
Life magazine.
Right, so like a Life magazine
not something like this size, but twice that.
That's correct. That's correct. That would be that book would be closer to something called a quarto, which would be about half the size of the folio. And what made it interesting was a folio size conveys some kind of gravitas to the work that's in it. And prior to this first folio of Shakespeare, that size had really been reserved for political and religious tracts of some gravity.
Not fiction or literature.
Not fiction, not literature, and certainly not plays which were not regarded as literature. They were regarded as ephemeral amusements for the masses. The first folio was a memorial volume that two of Shakespeare's friends, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, put together as a tribute to their deceased friend. And
may I ask, Andrew Mays, welcome. It's so good to talk to you about your fantastic book, which I enjoyed thoroughly. I found it a work not only of consummate scholarship, but a page-turner, a thrilling adventure read, eminently accessible. Congratulations on it.
well, thank you. Coming from you, that is high praise indeed.
You're very kind. Now, of course, we'll talk about the subtitle of your book, if I may quote, Henry Folger's obsessive hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. But I think it might be helpful originally to talk about those two men in the context of their times. Of course, they were, if I may, two men both alike in dignity, to quote from Shakespeare, and yet separated by 400 years and the Atlantic Ocean. Very, very different. But they shared one thing, a passion for, in the one case, writing, the other for collecting. But really put them in the context of their lives, if you would, please.
Sure. Well, Shakespeare was writing around the 1600s. His life was 20 years before, 20 years after the 1600s, during the reign of Elizabeth and James I. And he was a well-known playwright, poet. He wrote sonnets. And he was also a businessman. He was a shareholder in a theater company, the Globe Theater Company in London, and landowner, and very well known in his time for being a playwright and businessman. Henry Folger was the chairman, first president, then chairman of the board of the Standard Oil Company.